Hello, I'm Professor Susan Kellogg of the History Department here at UH, and this is Latin American Studies 3300. I have lots of information to give you about the course, as well as lots of background information that we need to go over today in order to get started, but I'm going to do that a little later. Instead, we are going to start the course by diving right into some material with Professor Rex Kuntz of the Art Department, who teaches art history here at UH, and talk about the art and archaeology of pre-Columbian or pre-Hispanic Latin America. Professor Kuntz.
Thank you, Professor Kellogg. Welcome to the lecture on pre-Columbian culture, or really I should say cultures, because what we're going to look at today is just how variegated the cultural landscape was before the coming of the Spanish. And this is important for two reasons. One reason is that quite often in reconstructions of Latin American colonial and even modern history, we have an idea that pre-Columbian peoples, pre-Columbian thought and civilizations are all one thing, or somehow a mass unto themselves. Where when we look at the history, we actually see an incredibly varied cultural landscape. The other thing is, and I will argue this at length over the course of this lecture, is that pre-Columbian history provides us with one of the great laboratories of human development. The pre-Columbian peoples, unlike those of the Old World, had no connection with the initial sinners of urbanism and civilization in ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, and ancient China. They developed, as we will see, on their own. So that this story is another great chapter in the history of the development of complex human society. Now, we may not think of these things when we initially think of pre-Columbian culture. In fact, we often think of the Aztec and the Inca, and for very good reason. These are the two great civilizations that were present at the coming of the Spanish. Thus, what we see is a lot of documents, a lot of words on these cultures by the Spanish and by the native people who spoke with the Spanish. Of course, the Inca and the Aztec were just the last manifestation of an enormous cultural development that took place over literally thousands of years on the American continent. But some of the things that have stuck with the image of the Aztec and the Inca, we will be discussing. For example, the bloody sacrifices of the Aztec so shocked the Spanish that they wrote about it endlessly. So interested Renaissance commentators like Michel de Montaigne that he used it as a mirror to explore the barbarism of Europe. We will talk a little bit about what that could have meant to the Aztec themselves, as well as the mountain redoubt of the Inca, Machu Picchu, that you see on the screen. Here we have some of the finest stone cutting technique and an enormous public works project that says a lot, not only about art and archaeology and architecture, but about governance, about the organization of society. And we're going to be talking about what we can glean from these sorts of massive public works project. But to begin the story, we have to begin well before the Aztec and the Inca. I mean, in some ways, again, the history of pre-Columbian cultures and civilizations is a special chapter of the history of Homo sapiens. We know, for example, that Homo sapiens left Africa by around 100,000 BCE. This seems like an almost trivial or tangential fact in the context of ancient American history, of pre-Columbian history, but in fact it is not, because of course it is these same peoples who then later crossed the Bering Strait, and we have very good evidence that in fact they were in Monteverde in Chile by 14,000 BCE. This is the oldest confirmed, well-established date that we have for early humans, and it is all the way down in South America. So obviously humans were in the Americas before this. What is crucial for understanding the later development of Homo sapiens, of humans, in the continent is the fact that after the land bridge closed, there was no significant contact with the rest of the world for 10,000 years, for the next 10,000 years, from 9,000 BCE to 1000 CE. The Americas were, in one sense, a laboratory of human development. In another sense, in a very real and somewhat tragic sense, the Americas also were never exposed to the circulation of microbes, of germs, that the old world experienced in waves throughout that entire 10,000 year period. And thus, when Europeans came to these shores in the late 15th and early 16th century, they brought with them microbes and germs that had circulated in the old world and to which humans had made some sort of accommodation that the native peoples had absolutely no immunity to. And this is a huge part of the more tragic consequences of the meeting of these two worlds. So it brings us really two things, this isolation. It brings us this amazing story of a parallel development of human complexity, as well as sets the stage for perhaps the chief reason that the collision of these two cultures, European and American, was so tragic for the latter. Now, the continent is varied. And in fact, we are going to be concentrating on the areas of high civilization, Mesoamerica and the Andean region, or the Andes. This encompasses mainly the current country of Peru. Mesoamerica consists of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, parts of Honduras, and El Salvador. The reason that we're going to concentrate on these two areas is they are the places of high civilization, the places of the most complex cultural developments, such as urbanism, massive public works and the organization of society that requires, of course, the complex government apparatus that goes with, and they also exerted influence over large areas beyond their particular political borders. This area of richness and of social complexity is or are the two areas that the Spanish immediately went towards in their conquest of the Americas because of the vast labor pools and the enormous mineral wealths that these two areas controlled. So that when we learn about Mesoamerica and the Andes, we are not just learning about this great development of complexity, we're learning about these areas that then become the centers of Spanish colonial interest in Spanish colonial society over the course of the colonial period, and in fact still are incredibly central to Latin American culture and Latin American society and history today. They did this, though, in pre-Columbian times with a technology that is essentially Stone Age. Their major tools were either of wood and or stone. There was the knowledge of metalworking, but it never attained the importance, the interest, the centrality that it did in the old world. This is another major factor then in later developments in the collision of the two cultures. But what I want to talk about today is the development of complex culture in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Our chief question, the focal point of all the talk today, is how did complex culture develop? If it was not by diffusion, and diffusion, of course, out of Mesopotamia, Egypt, centers in China, is how we define the rise of complex culture in the old world if we cannot use that explanation in the New World, then how do we explain it? It's a fascinating parallel case. We're going to start with and focus on Mesoamerica because this is the center of northern Latin American culture later. In fact, it's the center of viceregal culture in general during the colonial period, and because we actually know most about its development earlier. Mesoamerica, as I said, is defined by the southern half of Mexico, or encompasses the southern half of Mexico, all of Guatemala, all of Belize, and parts of El Salvador and Honduras. Of course, it, like the rest of the Americas, was populated by 9000 BCE. We know this. We have physical evidence of this. And in fact, this early period is called the Paleo-Indian Period. From the entry, again, by at least 9000 BCE to about 5000 BCE. These peoples, like many peoples all over the globe at the time, were hunters and gatherers. They did not control agriculture. They didn't grow their own crops. They did not settle into villages. They did not live what we call a sedentary lifestyle. They followed food and game. But after 7000 BCE, because of changing climatic conditions, the Americas, in fact, witnessed a warming trend, dried out to a certain extent, and the large mammals on which they depended for a lot of their protein died out in the Americas. The great mastodons, the great beasts that we associate with Paleolithic culture, with Old Stone Age culture all around the world, were extinct in the Americas very early on. There is some debate as to why that happened. Was it a combination of the drought and overhunting? Is the probable and best explanation. Some people rely more on overhunting, others on the drought. But for whichever mixture of those two you like, by 7000 BCE, humans were largely confined to small animals, rabbits say, and the manipulation of plants. Plants become more and more important over the later Paleo-Indian period, and in fact into the Archaic, which is defined by its emphasis on the domestication of certain food plants. The Archaic period witnesses, and note it's a 3,500 year period from 5000 BCE to 1500 BCE, and in that huge amount of time were some of the most miraculous cultural developments that set the stage for everything else that happens in Mesoamerica and in fact in the Americas, and that is the domestication of the major food crops. Again, there was a reason for this. Perhaps necessity is the mother of invention in this particular case. The drier conditions, the extinction of the big animals made it necessary for humans to find stable food crops that they could grow. Intensive plant gathering led to this, and there's a great sequence that has been laid out by very careful archaeology as to how these corn plants then came to be ever larger and eventually became the major foodstuff, because we are talking about maize or corn as the central foodstuff, but also beans, squash, and other gourd plants. Maize, though, becomes the center of Mesoamerican life at this point, and in fact diffuses over a huge range. At the end of the Archaic period, we find maize also in the Andean region, for example, by 1500 BCE. But it was almost certainly domesticated in what we call Mexico today, somewhere in Mexico, in the area of Puebla, Tlaxcala, most probably, in the modern states of Puebla, Tlaxcala, south of Mexico City. The thing that's important about maize, of course, is that it was domesticated to such an extent by the end of the Archaic period that it could no longer reproduce without human intervention. In fact, it still can no longer reproduce without human intervention. The way that it had been cultivated, the manipulation that had already gone on by the end of the Archaic. Corn or maize was so central to not only the Mesoamerican diet, but Mesoamerican thinking, that you see corn gods, maize gods, all over the Mesoamerican area and beyond. This that you see in front of you, of course, is the Maya version of the maize god. Those peoples in Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. But we see maize gods for the later Aztec. We see maize gods in all sorts of circumstances across Mesoamerica. So it becomes not only a plant that one eats, but a plant that one thinks with, in the words of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that one really has to know about maize is that without certain preparatory processes, maize would in fact not be the basis. It could not serve as the basis for a civilization. In fact, it needs to be mixed with certain minerals to allow the B vitamins and other important nutrients to be released from the corn. And very, very early on, and it's through making tamales and tortillas with a little bit of lime dissolved in water to make what we call the masa, that these B vitamins and other essential nutrients are released. Corn on the cob could not serve, interestingly enough, as the basis of civilization. So it's not just corn or maize that is the bedrock of Mesoamerican civilization, but it's the particular preparation of maize that leads to tamales in the Maya area in the south and tortillas in the north in what is ancient Mexico that is crucial to this development. By 1500 BC, then, we see the foodstuff that is going to serve as the basis of Mesoamerican civilization well established. At that time, we see the rise of the first cities. Now, these are, in the grand scheme of things, fairly humble affairs compared with later Mesoamerican cities. They occur in southern Veracruz state in Mexico, along wide, winding tropical rivers that would have flooded, that do flood regularly, much like the Nile in Egypt. The area that these rivers flood then becomes incredibly fertile, able to support up to 3 corn harvests a year. And it is this almost naturally occurring intensive agriculture on the river levees that served as the food basis for these first cities. San Lorenzo being the earliest that has yet been found and can be dated to 1200 BCE. San Lorenzo and these other Olmec cities were based on this intensive riverine agriculture, the growing of massive amounts of crops to support the 3,000 or so inhabitants of the city that specialized in things like stone cutting, jade working, governance, and a myriad of other governmental, bureaucratic, and urban activities. Right? They almost immediately, a fine art tradition directly connected with the government, with the people who rule in these capital cities, flourished. We see its principal deity on the screen. This deity can be directly associated with fertility and the propagation of corn and other crops. In fact, as you see, there is a cleft in its head from which, in Olmec art, oftentimes plants emerge. And so this deity, although we would like to know more about its specific meanings, this deity definitely has something to do with the growing of crops and this intensive agriculture that served as the economic base. Other aspects of it are less easily explained. For example, the upturned upper lip, the snarl that this deity takes as one of its defining features has never been adequately explained. Some see it as a jaguarian characteristic, as the jaguar, one of the most predatory and powerful beasts of this region in the jungle environment. Others see it as deformations in newborn infants. This too, while it may seem strange on the face of it, has a venerable heritage in the iconographic literature, in the literature that attempts to explain the symbol system. What is important for us and what is undeniable is the fact that these are large, huge boulders of jade that have been very finely carved by specialists. And this is incredibly important, whatever that deity may refer to, whatever that deity may mean. Jade simply does not occur anywhere in the Olmec area, anywhere in this area of southern Veracruz. And in fact, the Olmec had to go to great lengths to acquire this very sacred green stone. And in fact, this green stone was to serve as the currency of the elite, as the prized possession of the Mesoamerican elite from this time forward. We know now that the Olmec acquired this jade from the upper reaches of the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala. This is quite a long way away. And in fact, it shows us that the Olmec had to establish all sorts of links, trade links, with peoples all around Mesoamerica to acquire what it is they needed. Not only jade, but also obsidian to cut with. Remember, this is a society, it's a culture without metal tools, any workable metal tools. So they used the volcanic glass obsidian to do all their major cutting. This is like obsidian then serves as the metal for Mesoamerica and is just as valuable as metal was in Old World history, just as central as metal was in Old World history. The San Lorenzo peoples and other Olmecs traded for this and for jade and for all sorts of other commodities they deemed precious all around Mesoamerica. And as they did, of course, they exchanged ideas of human organization. The people of the Olmec were living in cities. Nobody else was. They exchanged ideas of religion. For example, this deity with the flame brows and the upturned upper lip shows up all over Mesoamerica, sometimes as early as it shows up in the Olmec area of southern Veracruz as well. So, as well as diffusing out ideas of urbanism and complex culture, the Olmec were almost certainly taking in ideas of the supernatural, of precious commodities, of ways of looking at the world that other peoples in Mesoamerica who had not yet embraced urbanism were sending their way. Another amazing chapter, and this happens very, very early on, is the development of fully three-dimensional, life-size or near life-size sculpture. Now, this would be a purely artistic move if we did not know the context that these sculptures resided in Olmec cities. And in fact, these three-dimensional, very naturalistic, very lifelike sculptures were set out in tableaux vivants, in sort of stage-designed sets in Olmec cities, oftentimes interacting with one another. And this we owe to very recent archaeological discoveries in San Lorenzo and elsewhere, where we have found these three-dimensional sculptures in situ, in groups, where they obviously, in fact, relate to one another. Now, why is this important? Because these are naturalistic and lifelike, and more than this, we know from various pieces of evidence that they are portraits. These three-dimensional lifelike sculptures are portraits of living human beings, and in fact they are portraits of the rulers and their close kin, their close associates, so that Olmec cities were dotted with reminders of the power and greatness of the elite, because of course no one else had access to or could construct these three-dimensional sculptures. It's very interesting to note that recently the sculpture workshop for the earliest Olmec capital was located. We found the debitage, we found the half-worked sculptures that they left behind when the city fell, and it was located directly adjacent to the palace of the rulers, so that we have the artists who constructed the royal image or the ruler's image and the ruler themselves in the palace directly adjacent to it. So it's very clear that this monumental artwork, and in fact the monumental architecture that went with it, that often framed these three-dimensional sculptures, were directly associated with an elite ruling class in the center of these cities. So that monumental art, just like in Egypt, and this analogy has been made by several people, actually comes from the people who control the river levees and the wealth of the first cities. So that we have rulers patronizing, creating this first great art style, which is the Olmec art style, in the center of these first urban environments, these first cities in Mesoamerica. Olmec culture can be seen as an unbroken continuity between 1200 BCE, when we see the rise of those first cities, and in fact we see Olmec cultural forms, Olmec art, even earlier, but we see the rise of the first cities by 1200 BCE, to the fall of the last Olmec capital by about 400 BCE. This is an incredibly long range of time when one thinks about it, 800 years of an unbroken continuity of a series of capitals in the Olmec area of southern Veracruz. And I should say that there are cities lying there in that southern Veracruz area that we know exist, but that we have no good idea when they were built or of what they consist. The great one is Laguna de los Cerros, again in southern Veracruz, which was as large as any of the Olmec capitals that have been excavated, but we simply know almost nothing about it. So stay tuned. Olmec history is certain to be revised and to become richer as work on these cities continues. But to get back to the chronology, we are here in these first cities between 1200 BCE and 400 BCE. At the end, towards the end of that period, we see the rise of all sorts of regional cultures across Mesoamerica that build on the urbanism, the social organization, and the art style, and the religious system that the Olmec and the peoples of Mesoamerica were in fact trading all over that early period. By 400 BCE, the traders, the people with whom the Olmec were trading, are beginning to form their own cities. Monte Alban in Oaxaca is a great example. By 400 BCE, it is beginning to be fully formed. We see this in the Maya area, in the jungle, what is now the jungles of Guatemala. By 400 BC, we see massive earthworks and cities taking root. There we see it, in fact, all over Mesoamerica. And in fact, in the Olmec area itself, in southern Veracruz, we see the development of other cities which bear Olmec imprints but are not exact copies of, or can't be seen as really the continuity of Olmec civilization. What we find is a regionalism, a breaking apart of the Olmec world system. This continues for the next 500 years, but by 100 CE, by 100, the year 100 in this era, we get an entirely new development. And that is one city that can be considered so central to the rest of Mesoamerican history that it is referred to often as the metropolis, Teotihuacan. Near the Valley of Mexico. In fact, it's a sidearm of the Valley of Mexico, in the highlands of Mexico, in the mountains. So what we see here is a completely different environment, not the lush, tropical, riverine environment that we see the early cities in, both in the Maya area and then even earlier in the Olmec area. It is in the much more arid highlands. certainly corn still grows here, but there's a whole level of other crops that grow. Maguey or agave was very important to these peoples, as was mining obsidian. In fact, these are the peoples who controlled one of the great obsidian mines, and again, reed metal, in all of Mesoamerica. And so that a place that was earlier trading with the Olmec peoples, but living in much smaller, much less complex organizational patterns, now becomes a huge city. In fact, by 100 CE, you have 40,000 people and more pouring in every day into Teotihuacan. Again, this is on a scale that the Olmec never even conceived of. By 100 CE is a reality. We're going to look at Teotihuacan closely because it's going to serve as the exemplary city for not only for Mesoamerica but for the Americas. It's one of the great examples of urbanism that we have before the Spanish. And this is one of the, of course, our chief interests today, was defining this complex urbanistic culture. It also has some of the greatest examples, preserved examples of monumental architecture that is well documented. And it has a very long history that we can see develop. Again, Teotihuacan is centered in the Valley of Mexico, where today Mexico City resides. In fact, Teotihuacan is only about a 45-minute bus ride from one of the central Mexico City bus stations. It inhabits the center of a large valley through which a river runs that served as a source of irrigation and intensive agriculture throughout the valley. But by the height of Teotihuacan civilization, between 400 and about 650 CE, there were 125,000 people in the city. There is no way that that valley alone could have supported such a population. So we have trade all over Mesoamerica in foodstuffs and other things, but especially around that area we have a huge catchment area, a huge area of influence around Teotihuacan, in which food would have been flowing in and all sorts of other goods would have been flowing in and out. And again, I want to emphasize the complete change in scale here. We have moved from tropical cities of 3,000 to 5,000 to a city of 125,000. What caused this change, and how did they organize themselves in such massive amounts of humanity? And this on a worldwide scale. Teotihuacan was easily one of the 10 largest cities in the world at the time, at its absolute height around 500 CE. Demographers reckon that it was the 4th largest city in the world. How did this take place? Well, interestingly, there were catastrophes, volcanism, there were volcanoes, and especially the eruption of Sheet-Lab sometime between 100 BCE and 100 CE was crucial for the rise of Teotihuacan, because Teotihuacan was relatively unaffected by this massive blast in the center of the Valley of Mexico, whereas many of the other people living around that central valley, which was a rich lake environment, lacustrine environment, many other people were gravely affected by this. And Teotihuacan's rival, the city of Cuicuilco, was in fact almost utterly demolished by the eruption of this volcano. Teotihuacan then became the sole important center in this upland highland environment and grew enormously between this time and quite frankly kept growing for several centuries afterwards. Its organization was amazing. Its organization was awe-inspiring in that everything built at Teotihuacan was oriented to the street that you see on your screen. Everything was oriented towards what is now called the Avenue of the Dead. We have no idea if the Teotihuacanos actually called it thus. This was the name that the Aztecs gave it much later. But the palaces of the elite were found on either side of this great Avenue of the Dead, and everyone else was housed in closely packed urban apartments on either side and spreading out from this street. And every apartment, every room in every apartment was oriented exactly to the same more or less 16 degrees east of north that the central avenue was oriented to. So what we have is this notion that Teotihuacan was an incredibly planned environment, exquisitely, minutely planned environment from the very beginning. It was laid out with this central grid right around 100 CE, 150 CE. And from that time forward, throughout its entire history, it was constructed to that specification. This is said, and I think rightly, to many scholars, that the government of Teotihuacan, the elite, the people who in fact control this development, were an incredibly powerful group of people who could in fact invoke such a carefully planned environment and execute such a carefully planned environment. Now, why people bought into this, and what we have is an enormous in-migration into the city from much smaller villages and what could be termed small cities throughout this period, so that at Teotihuacan's apogee, about 400 CE, about 90% of the population of the Valley of Mexico, this central focal point of Mesoamerican culture, lived in Teotihuacan. It's an amazing development. It asks one, why? I mean, it begs the question, why did they do this? And what we've come up with is the study of the monuments themselves, the probable meanings of these monuments, as some insight into the ideology or the worldview that the elite created and that the people who moved there must have felt a strong attraction to. In the background of the image that you see is the huge, one of the largest buildings in Mesoamerica, the Pyramid of the Sun, the base of which covers about 13 acres, just to give you an idea of how tremendous this thing is, inside of which there's a cave system. A cave system that had been modified by humans to look especially like a lobed cave, a cave with several lobes on it. Later on in Mesoamerican mythology and Mesoamerican narrative, this lobed cave is the sacred starting point for all peoples. The Aztec called it Chicomostoc, the seven caves. This is the place where of venerable beginnings. This is the place where the ancestors came from. Many scholars have pointed out the fact that the Pyramid of the Sun is a probable recreation of this place of venerable beginnings, and thus became a place of high sacrality and pilgrimage. And this was one of the great draws to the site. In fact, the Pyramid of the Sun was one of the first massive public works. Even before the apartment buildings, the Pyramid of the Sun was built. Another building, equally interesting, and in fact much more highly decorated, is the so-called Temple of Quetzalcoatl. It has a huge feathered serpent on its facade, and inside, and this is recent archaeological discoveries, inside we have the burial of dozens of sacrificed warriors. This gives us insight into the military might that Teotihuacan wielded during this time, and in fact puts to rest quite a number of theories about the meaning of Teotihuacan as a peaceful theocratic society. The burials inside this Temple of Quetzalcoatl really argue against that strongly. That Teotihuacan must have wielded significant military might to have such extensive military symbolism, the sacrifice of dozens of warriors inside this building. At the same time as the rise of Teotihuacan during this period, 150 CE to 650 CE, we get the rise of the lowland, the tropical Maya culture in Yucatan and Guatemala chiefly, and Belize. And here we have some developments that we do not see at Teotihuacan. We see an even more extensive three-dimensional sculptural system that is then serves as really the ruler's face in the city. This is a three-dimensional art system that specifically touts the doings of the ruler, in the face of the ruler. And directly associated with that is the invention of a full-blown writing system that can in fact document, that can record any spoken Maya word. It's a full writing system, just like the full writing systems of the Old World. This is the only time that we have this in the Americas, and this writing system is specifically there, as it is in Egypt, to document the doings of the king and the elite, to document their lineages, their religious rituals, their battles, etc. And the decipherment of this has been one of the great intellectual stories of Americanist culture. The Maya and the Teotihuacanos interacted constantly. They knew each other, they traded with each other. Teotihuacan, with its closely knit, incredibly controlled environment in its one great city, never adopted this extensive writing system. And in fact, we are beginning to understand that this writing system grows out of Olmec experiments as well, I should say. This is brand new archaeology, but just recently, this is 2007, in 2006 was found a block of stone in the Olmec area, dated to Olmec times, that is clearly the beginnings of this Maya writing style. But the Teotihuacanos somehow rejected this writing style, or the whole idea of writing. Whereas the Maya embraced it, but they also embraced an incredible diversity of political organization. There were many cities in the Maya area. There was the one great metropolis in ancient Mexico, Teotihuacan. In the Maya area, there are literally dozens of important cities and 2 or 3 what we would call metropoli, great cities that really vied for ultimate power. Again, this is happening, interestingly, in an environment completely different from the Teotihuacano environment. The Teotihuacan environment is cool in the uplands of highland Mexico around this rich lake, whereas we are getting comparable urbanism, comparable complex civilization in what is now the jungle of Guatemala. And some of these cities could rival, if not equal, Teotihuacan. Tikal, for example, had a population of around 100,000 people. But they did not control the settling of the city in anything like the Teotihuacanos did. So we talked earlier on about the variability of pre-Columbian culture, and there are obviously different paths to urbanism, different paths to complex cultures, although these people were sharing ideas of governance, of religion, all the time, as well as goods. Both Teotihuacan and the classic Maya civilization that grew up together collapsed. Teotihuacan earlier, around 650 CE, and the great cities of the southern Maya area by 900. The last monument that we know that records a ruler's doings is 909 CE. At the site of Tonina in Mexico. But from the ashes of this, and in fact at the same time, grew up a new synthesis both in the Maya area and in Mexico, in the sites of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, the most touristed, the most visited Mesoamerican site, and Tula, not far at all from Teotihuacan, in the central valley of Mexico. These people transformed but passed on or incorporated many of the religious ideas and the ideas of governance that we see earlier in the art and archaeology of Teotihuacan and the Maya area, including central pyramids that are either burial places for great rulers or places of great things that are valued that are buried there, what we call caches. They are viewed as mountains, just like the earlier Teotihuacan mountain. In fact, in Maya, we have Maya texts that call them wheats or mountains. They are viewed as these sacred mountains from which the ancestors came. Many of these ideas passed on to the later Aztec. And in fact, the Aztec constructed their great city, Tenochtitlan, which was even larger and more populous than Teotihuacan, around a central pyramid that they viewed as the place of the ancestors, in fact, the place where their patron deity was born. They created huge artworks to illustrate the great events in the life of their deity and placed it around the central pyramid. This is where the people were brought in to re-experience these rites, all under the aegis of the government. This idea of government control, of the great controlling narratives of the polity of the people, can be seen all the way back in Olmec times, where these first cities were really stage sets for the reenactment of these great narratives and the portraits of the great rulers, both living and dead. With the Aztec, of course, we return to the scene of Teotihuacan. The Aztec viewed themselves as heirs to the culture of Tula, which it in turn was heir to the culture of Teotihuacan, so there is real continuity there. And of course today, Tenochtitlan, we would like to know much more about it archaeologically, but it is underneath modern Mexico City. But as we stated in the preface to this lecture, the Aztec are really not the culmination, but simply another step in the development of complex culture that can be seen as a continuity from Olmec, these early Olmec riverine cities, through Teotihuacan, all the way to Aztec culture. We focused on Mesoamerica today, but the other great area of complex culture and urbanism is, of course, the Andean region, named for the great spine of mountains that goes through the contemporary country of Peru, also volcanic, also able to support very different ecologies, very different materials, very different foodstuffs can be grown in the different elevations. These then become trade items up and down towards the coast, the coast with its rich fishing, the uplands growing different plants and beasts of burden like llamas. All of this then looks a little like Mesoamerica with its incredibly varied environments in which all these people traded. Now, in many ways, too, the chronological divisions of the Andean region follow to some extent what we see in Mesoamerica. It's helpful to have these chronological divisions in mind when thinking about pre-Columbian history in general, although one has to realize that you have to adjust for regional developments, regional chronologies, etc. But in the Andean region, there is also a Paleo-Indian, followed by an Archaic, in which there is a lot of work with plants. The same sorts of general climatic conditions hold. There is a so-called formative period in which we see the first cities, the first complex urban developments, but unlike in Mesoamerica, at the very beginning of the formative, which has to be pushed back a little earlier. In fact, by 2000 BCE, this is already well in place. We have monumental earthworks, monumental pyramids that are not connected with any large grouping of people. They're not in the middle of a city. And what this shows, Caral, which is dated to 2600 BCE to 2100 CE, these enormous mounds in Peru. What this shows is that before there are even aggregations of humans in urban environments, there is this idea to build large markers on the landscape to celebrate or commemorate people, things, narrative events that were of importance to the group. These are pilgrimage sites. And this almost certainly, or certainly did occur in Mesoamerica as well. The idea of pyramids as pilgrimage sites. In fact, it's very interesting that many contemporary Maya, the Lacandon, view Maya classic sites as sites of pilgrimage. And this is probably something of an extrapolation of the function that they already had. But in Peru, this sort of pilgrimage site and the idea that one organizes labor to construct these huge monuments to then go to in circuits, in pilgrimage routes, occurs extremely early, mind-bogglingly early, before they even develop ceramic traditions, for example. I mean, they don't even have a viable tradition of clay bowls, and they are building these pyramids. This gives the Andean trajectory a completely different feel in its early phases. Later, as cities develop, there's something of a realignment with the Mesoamerican trajectory, but there's still, even when the Spanish come, there's still this emphasis on the pilgrimage, on these great public works that are organized oftentimes by people themselves that then feed into the idea of a religious circuit. One other difference, fundamental difference, that I would like to focus on is the different ideas of political art or of the fundamental human creative endeavor. In Mesoamerica, it is without a doubt sculpture. What you see on one side of your screen is the portrait of an Olmec ruler. This is one of the earliest sculptures that we have. This is over 6 feet high and weighs 20 metric tons, just to give you an idea of the amazing power that these must have evidenced for the ruler who could commission these things. In the Andean region, the great sign of eliteness, the great sign of wealth, is textile production. And in fact, the great artistic statements are in general in textiles. Compared to Mesoamerica, Andean sculpture, Andean painting is impoverished. But the textile tradition is remarkable. What you have is a tradition of drawing, painting, and sculpting versus a tradition of weaving. You have a tradition that develops writing and extensive record keeping in that way versus a tradition that has an almost computational idea of recording information, and that is the quipu, which was the way that these complex bureaucracies that ruled over large swaths of Andean civilization were able to keep tabs on their people and their development, so that I promised you that we would see both the similarities, the commonalities, and some of the basic differences in the rise of the two great civilizations in pre-Columbian culture. Both of them, Mesoamerica and the Andes, engaged in extensive urbanism. They were city-dwelling people with all the cultural complexity that ensues from that way of organizing oneself. They both engaged in massive public works, although we have this very interesting early history in the Andes not connected to the sorts of complex political scenarios that we have for Mesoamerica. We do, in both of those places, have complex governmental apparatuses. One develops writing just like in Egypt and in Mesopotamia to record and to organize themselves. The other has this really remarkable quipu system to record things. Both of them create then a huge area of influence around them, which becomes what we call a world system. A sort of place in which most people have a similar understanding of their environment, of who wields power, of why they do, of who's trading with whom, a connected system. Both Mesoamerica and the Andes can be called these world systems. And these world systems are, of course, exactly what the Spanish want to hook into immediately upon arrival. Why? Because these are the ways that wealth circulates through these world systems. I want to leave you with a somewhat obscure point at first, and that is, we talked at the very beginning of this lecture about the fact that there is no pre-Columbian culture, there is no pre-Columbian civilization, and to lump all of these peoples into one big morass is wrong-headed. And I want to think just for a minute about the variety and the complexity of pre-Columbian history. Is good to keep in mind when we compare it to later Latin American modernisms, where native ways of doing things are often seen as sort of anti-modern or swimming against the modernist stream, whereas other peoples looking towards Europe are in fact buying into modernist paradigms. Well, there is a level on which that is undeniably true, but it often also gets argued in cultural realms and in realms in which a knowledge of the variety and the complexity of pre-Columbian culture is in fact very helpful. In some ways, we have a sort of pre-modern history of complexity already at our fingertips in Latin America. And that, I would argue, along with this idea that pre-Columbian civilizations are some of the great examples of individual, idiosyncratic even, development of complex culture not tied to the old world. It's in those two things that the study of pre-Columbian civilizations is undeniably an important part of our task as Latin American historians, students of Latin American culture in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kuntz. We really appreciate the wonderful introduction to the art and archaeology of Latin America that you have provided today. Professor Kuntz focused primarily on Mesoamerica and the Andes, and he emphasized a point that I will also emphasize today, others will emphasize, and that will recur throughout the semester, and that is that while we consider Latin America to be one place, Latin America is in fact many places, and there are lots of plural and multiple ways to talk about Latin America that are very important, and I'll come back to that point a little bit later today. What I want to do now is to sum up some of Professor Kuntz's major points and to talk about the class more generally. In the second half of today's class, I'll talk a bit more about the indigenous past, and then I'll talk about the early history of Spain and Portugal or Iberia, because it's impossible to understand the conquests that took place in Latin America without understanding both sides and the culture and history that both sides or both groups that came together brought to that meeting. That is the indigenous side, whose art, history, and culture Professor Kuntz has already talked about for us, and the European side. And I want to provide some background about Spain and Portugal and Iberia that will help us understand this meeting, the exploration that each side did of the other as they came together, and then ultimately the conquests of the indigenous groups by Europeans. I think one way to sum up what Professor Kuntz has said, he's suggested for us, and I'll pick up with this point next week, one point that he suggested for us is that a clear understanding of the history of the indigenous cultures of Latin America is a must for understanding the processes of change that take place after the arrival of Europeans. I think that's a more straightforward way of repeating what I previously said. Some of the important points that he talked about include the fact that Latin America is made up of many different cultures. It is in the present, it was in the distant past. He talked about Mesoamerica and the Andes, but used Mesoamerica as a sort of symbol or laboratory for understanding the ways that some of these cultures developed. The idea that cultures developed and changed over time, that there were different cultural groupings, that is all true. But as cultures developed and changed, they still carried with them some of the techniques of labor and working with material items, some of the cultural beliefs, some of the aspects of social systems, especially the development of hierarchy, the development of class. They carried with them all these ideas and ways of doing things over time as change took place. In looking at how especially complex cultures developed, he emphasized the ideas of urbanism, the building of large public works, the complex kinds of governments that developed. He emphasized the ideas that in Mesoamerica and in the Andes, each of these regions had large spheres of influence. The cultures, especially in the period just before the arrival of Europeans, the cultures of these areas had large spheres of influence. He talked about the simplicity in some ways of the technology that was used. Within a Stone Age technology, there was some complexity of development over time, but the technology was not the greatest area of development, and many other aspects of ideology, knowledge, and belief were, however, highly developed, and we saw some examples of that in the political and in the religious art that Professor Kuntz showed. To move on from the ideas that he talked about and to get into some aspects of the class, that's what I want to talk about in the time that remains now. As is noted on the syllabus, this is the first course on Latin American studies to be taught at the University of Houston. This does not mean that there aren't lots of classes taught about Latin America here at the university. What it does mean is that this is the first class to cover a wide variety of approaches, from archaeology and the arts to history, literature, and the humanities, to anthropology, economics, and political science. That is some of the social sciences. So you will be learning about Latin America in a comprehensive way, and at the same time you'll get a sense of the areas of expertise and the research of individual faculty members. Thus, we will examine Latin America from many different, multiple perspectives. The pluralization of perspectives is intended to signal a number of ideas to you. First, Latin America does not have a single history, because we can and will define it geographically. In fact, what we North Americans refer to as Latin America is a very large, very diverse area geographically. It spans parts of North and all of South America, as well as parts of the Caribbean. And the multiple areas which make up Latin America themselves have different histories and cultures. Can we cover every area? Can we cover every country in depth this semester? No, we cannot. But what we can do is stress the idea that Latin America has multiple histories, not a single history, multiple cultures. It did in the past, as has already been mentioned today. It does in the present, and it will in the future. It has multiple economies, varying political systems, and all of these historical, cultural, and social differences mean that Latin America has also given birth to multiple artistic forms of expression. In art, in literature, in music, in dance, there are a tremendous number of varieties of all these different kinds of artistic expression, and we won't hear about all of them, but we will hear about some of them this semester. And one of the things that I hope happens this semester, both by talking about all these different forms of multiplicity, of history, culture, and society, and by hearing from different faculty members who teach about these different aspects of Latin America, I hope all of this is going to come together, not in gigantic muddle. It probably won't come together either in a 100% perfectly systematic way. But what it will suggest to you is that there are many different perspectives, many different ways to understand Latin America. You will understand many of the most important of those ways, and you will get a sense of the importance of this region in terms of hemispheric history and global history in terms of hemispheric cultures and global cultures. And that's what our goal really is, to talk about the many different ways that we can understand Latin America, to look at many different aspects of Latin America, and to understand its place in what is an increasingly complex world, but also an increasingly integrated world in which it's important to understand all the different parts of the world and how these come together in global systems. To come back to the idea of pluralization, the pluralization of histories, cultures, and societies also reflects the fact that the peoples of Latin America come from a diversity of cultural, ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. A full understanding of the events and processes of history, whether we're talking about the pre-Hispanic era, the colonial era, or the modern period, a full understanding of any period of Latin American history, or the contemporary period for that matter, means that we have to understand really a lot about the diversity of cultures that came together and the diversity of historical and cultural traditions that developed over the long span of time from whenever human beings first came to Latin America to the present time in 2007. So Latin Americans, if we think of them as a people, they don't have a single history. They don't have a single ethnic identity. They don't have a single religious identity. And in some ways, most importantly, or at least as importantly, they don't speak a single language. Many people today, of course, speak Spanish or Portuguese. Indigenous languages are still spoken. And the influence of indigenous languages and African languages, indigenous cultures and African cultures, is still very present in 2007 in many different parts of Latin America. So Latin America is the product of multiple streams of migration, cultural influence, and historical development. I've talked about the pluralization of Latin America in terms of its multiple histories. I've talked about it in terms of its multiple peoples and cultures. I also want to emphasize a third reason why the pluralizing of the terms that we'll use this semester when we talk about Latin America is important. And that is that because there are multiple streams of historical and cultural development taking place, that means that Latin American history itself, and history isn't our major or only focus this semester, but it is going to be used as a sort of thread to pull together many of the different topics and perspectives that we'll be talking about. What the idea of pluralization in terms of history does mean is that Latin American history is complex. Not just that there's lots of facts and it's going to be useful to actually know something about some of those facts, but nobody would ever require you or me to know all of them. But what I want to emphasize here is the idea that there are multiple causes for many of the events and processes of change that have taken place. Many different people participated and participate in the making of Latin American history, and there are many different causes of change. I can take what might seem like a single or simple question. Why did the Spanish conquer the Aztecs? And tell you that there is no one right answer to that. There are better answers, and there are certain factors that we do need to understand, one of which Professor Kuntz alluded to, and that's the role of disease. But that's a topic that I will get into more next week. But there are a whole lot of different factors that play into why it was that the Spanish, with a small number of men, were able to conquer a culture and civilization that was built upon thousands of years of development, that was populated by millions of people. A relatively small number of Spaniards, fewer than 1,000, were able to conquer a city that was the fourth largest city in the world at its time. But that's not the only question that has multiple causes and multiple answers. All sorts of questions, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask that illustrate the point about the complexity of causation. Why were the Spanish able to implant Catholicism? Not everywhere, not necessarily everywhere, not necessarily easily, not necessarily to 100% of the people in any particular region where they went, not necessarily deeply, especially at first. But the Spanish and the Portuguese wrought change in the religious landscape of Latin America that by 1700 was undeniable, is undeniably deep, and that helps to explain many aspects of Latin American cultures and societies today. Why were the Spanish able to do that? Why were relatively small groups of Catholic priests, who were largely defenseless, able to start to bring about this enormous change? Again, no one right answer. Why were African enslaved laborers brought to the Americas? Africans and slavery are part of the history of the United States, a crucial part of the history of the United States, but they actually went in much larger numbers to Latin America, where their labor in some parts of Latin America, especially in certain parts of the Caribbean and in Brazil, was fundamental to the making of colonial Latin America. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Again, there are factors that help us explain it, but not necessarily one right answer. What led to the Cuban Revolution? What led to the Mexican Revolution? If I want to be historically accurate, I should have listed those in the opposite order, chronologically. What led to those revolutions, which have had such an incredible impact on 20th century Latin America, to the point that they have a lasting impact into the 21st century and can help us explain and understand a lot about the contemporary political situation in Latin America. What led to those revolutions? Many different causes were in play. What is leading to the seeming turn of Latin America today? In 2007, what is leading to the seeming turn of Latin America to the left? Again, there are different countries involved. There are different groups of people and political parties involved. There are different political histories. So there's a lot of variety at work that we have to take into account. But in any one country where this is happening, there are many different factors of economy, politics, society, religion, culture, that we have to take into account in understanding the changing forms of politics in Latin America, both today and in the past. So for any of the big questions that we can ask about Latin America, both historically and in the present, there's a complex chain of events, interactions, and processes that we need to talk about in order to understand what took place, what is taking place, and maybe to make some predictions about what might take place in the future. But another point I want to emphasize is that deeply knowledgeable scholars can and do disagree about what they see as the major factors at work in bringing about these processes of change. There's nothing wrong with that disagreement. It's part of the way scholarship works, and it's important for us to look at different kinds of arguments. We can make judgments about which argument is better and why or why not. But it's important to look at the multiple histories, the multiple cultures, the multiple ideas, and the multiple perspectives of the past and the present in understanding Latin America as fully as we possibly can.